Hey everybody, welcome. Give me a moment as I navigate some underbrush here. I have many thoughts and ideas. And yesterday someone asked me, how do I choose what to speak about? Often I have something in mind before I begin. And sometimes I primarily listen to that agenda, and I've spoken about this previously. And sometimes I try to be sensitive to what's going on right here, right now. And in a living place, like this garden, what's really going on is communion. Living beings growing together. And sure, there's some predation. But competition in evolution, while demonstrable statistically, is not primarily what's going on. And a good portion of what's going on is and remains in a superposition, uncollapsed, right, into a specific mode or derivation or name for a relationship or behavior. Birds don't think about flying, at least not in the way that humans are inclined to habitually think about thinking. Interesting. The yellow jacket nest that was here is gone. Oh, maybe not. No, there's still a little activity there. Not as much. Time has changed. The living cycle of those yellow jackets has transformed. Or possibly, and I think somewhat likely, humans have also intervened. Living places, in my view, represent the superpositions that human thought is an example of a particular form of descent from. We have these incredible abilities for abstract thought. But these abilities are easily hijacked, particularly in the modern context, though it's always been true. And religions and institutions have been weaponizing ideas apparently for thousands of years. But the situation that we're in today represents a radical expansion of those processes and their explosive propagation into every aspect and moment of our thought, relationships, interiority, development. And to say that in general, the common people are unequipped for this is a terrifying understatement. In fact, even those of us who have practiced sense-making and system analysis and understanding cognition, we, right now and for the foreseeable future, are overwhelmed. And to some degree, the more sensitive we are, the more overwhelmed we are, because many very sensitive people, for all kinds of different reasons, learned to become troubleshooters, to see potential problems in the future and try to act in the present to avert them or to mitigate the damage they'll do. And in an individual life, in a context that isn't overtly malignant, that behavior, when done well, has some degree of efficacy. However, ambiguity reigns, and our attention is drawn toward things that have been called out, in a sense, surfaced in our consciousness due to our orientations and how we've been primed and our biases. Priming is the exposure to stimuli in a sequence. And human animals, in general, with some exceptions, are profoundly vulnerable to priming. The nightmare we call the Facebook newsfeed is an algorithmic priming device. And it's cygenic in the sense that its actual intent is to generate mind states. Cygenic mind making. And the order in which we see posts on social media is a priming and bias generator. So one of the first things that happens when we're exposed to a context like that is we begin to synchronize with the priming anchors and the timescales on which stimuli are presented. This is unimaginably dangerous. Oh, there's that word. To be careful of that. It's very dangerous. I was just listening to Daniel Schmachtenberger's YouTube video on self-development and other topics, and one of the things he said was, there is no algorithm for wisdom. He also implied that human consciousness is metacomputational, which I agree with. However, it's affectable by computation. It's particularly affectable by machine exposure. And unfortunately, though we can't create an algorithm for wisdom, we have the potential to do two other things, at least, many things, two I'm interested in. The first is inject fear, decoherence, desynchronization, outrage, anger, confusion. Our algorithms are fully capable of doing that for human beings at present. And they are doing it and succeeding. And the other thing we can do, even though there's no algorithm for wisdom, is we can develop technologies that help us make sense of the world and become more intelligent individually and together, moment to moment. And we've mostly done the opposite of that so far. So there is an interplay between computational technologies and minds, individual minds, societal mindsets, and so on, orientations. But it's broken on purpose. And the purpose isn't merely manipulation, like to be puppeted from above, right? The reverse Pinocchio problem, where actual boys and girls and men and women are turned into manipulable, doll-like representations of what they might otherwise have become together and individually. And that's been a priority, even if it wasn't a stated priority. Even before the internet existed, so unfortunately, we're very vulnerable. Now, most of my speaking so far has been as if I'm speaking from outside of time, right? I haven't been speaking about the current moment so much as I have features that led us to this. And Daniel has a great take on all of that stuff. It's absolutely brilliant. If you're interested, please subscribe to his channel and listen to his interviews. They're really good. And for people who are troubleshooters, and I've been a troubleshooter for over 30 years now, it fits in very succinctly with what we've been seeing and sensing and understanding as fundamental threats for many years. Certainly since the invention of atomic weapons. It was relatively easy for me to foresee 20 years ago because I came up during the inauguration of computational technologies, and I watched those develop. I watched the development of the internet and its various organs, smartphones and so on. And I've also watched the devolution of our societies, our institutions, what we clumsily refer to as our government. And it was clear to me a very long time ago, probably 40 years ago, when I was quite young, that these institutions and our government and so on were developing into an explosively self-accelerating disease factory. So that 20 years ago I could easily foresee a moment in the near future when technologies would, what's the right word, become advanced and profuse enough that either a single individual or a very small group of people would eventually become capable of a successful direct attack on the biosphere itself. And as we know from humans and history, our species has a love affair with war and weaponry that inclines us to produce the weapons that we can develop, whether overtly or covertly. Those two observations make it clear that it's not merely human existence that's presently at risk. It's the existence of the biosphere. And when corporations, institutions, and societies have become determined to drive toward extinction, which is the situation we are presently in, as I understand it, a series of cascades of accelerated environmental and human carnage ensues. In previous cycles, our species didn't have the ability to wipe out the basis of life on Earth. We have long had that ability. And I'm not really concerned with the question of whether or not Earth can recover ecologies in homeostasis, the capacity to sustain an atmosphere. I think that question is too intellectual by far, and too abstract, and also fundamentally unknowable. So what I'm concerned about today is to present some unfortunately grim tactical intelligence. Having studied these things for decades now, and been intimately aware of their potential for expression in the modern context, I'm afraid we've entered a situation of endgame. And I mean that in two ways. One, the strong potential for the end of all games. Obliterating the context entirely. And unfortunately, once the societies and institutions become bent on war during a time of extinction, the point of no return comes very quickly and is most likely already behind us. That doesn't, even if that's true, that's not hopeless. Because there is still the opportunity for us as individuals and groups to acquire meaningful roles and relationships and accomplish the kind of beauty that I think of as the foundation on which many representational layers of our humanity have been piled. So even if that's true, and the point of no return is behind us, there's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of unknowns, and we still have the opportunity for meaningful lives and roles, and maybe even heroic lives and roles. That's not so much my point, or it's not my objective to explore that too deeply. What I want to talk about is very pragmatic. It's tactical intelligence during conflict. And as we see the various domains of human, institutional, and societal behavior transform into conflict and toward war and manipulation and extinction, it's important to remain aware of common features of conflict contexts. Unfortunately, in battle, first moves matter a lot. And in a war on land, which is not the kind of war we're likely to be fighting, there are certain advantages available to the first person on the scene, or the first cohort on the scene. But the field is very complex because we're not talking about regular war. We're talking about maybe more than 100 different fields of conflict, each with unique features and threats and opportunities. But my simple point is, the big players, the nations, the corporations, they're going to move tactically. And what that means is they're going to both sequester and destroy resources to ensure those resources are not available to their competitors. This is a common endgame scenario in the second sense of the word, meaning preliminary combat's done, the mid-game has resolved to a finite field of play. And in terms of pragmatics, in a zero-sum game where someone wins and someone loses, our species is now in the cascade of events, priorities, and perspectives that are endemic to endgame warfare. The Earth can survive relatively modest endgame warfare by our species, as it has throughout history. It cannot survive anything resembling modern endgame warfare. Neither will our societies, our nations, our minds, or our people. We are profoundly unprepared for this. And most of us live either as elites, the wealthy, various kinds of worker classes, including there's a gradation, right, of workers from highly skilled and thus relatively valuable to vocations that are more or less slave-like. And what will happen as Endgame proceeds is that class distinctions and in-group distinctions will become hyperbolized. And the remaining ecological resources are likely to be rapidly converted to consumable assets and or destroyed so that others can't make use of them. None of us are equipped for a world like that. Those of us who have been trained for conflict are moderately more well equipped in the sense that they're capable of acting as soldiers or intelligence operatives or commanders and so on in various kinds of actual or conceptual battlefields. There was an old meme, kind of a cartoon called Cats, and in it there was a phrase, "Someone set us up the bomb." That's what happened. And what we're experiencing now, whether or not the novel coronavirus has anything to do with intentional human generation, the bombs were going off 10, 15 years ago, 5 years ago, 2 years ago. And they're doing damage. Most of it is hidden from us because we're still in the phase of Endgame where the appearance of the structured game board we've been being played on is still present. It's very difficult for me to imagine how that could possibly continue for very long. We and our children are going to witness an apocalypse. And we're going to be involved in that apocalypse very directly, in ways we have never imagined, in ways we are entirely unprepared for. I just want to be really clear that in a zero-sum endgame, the competition for dominance becomes incredibly fierce, incredibly fast. As if we needed more acceleration. What opposes Endgame? Is there any buffer? It's not clear. It's hard for me to see any useful functioning buffers that still remain. The ecologies were buffers for a long, long time, but they protected us primarily from things like starvation or radical temperature shift or loss of oxygen, stuff like this. And as we can see historically from wars among humans, the environment gets used as a pawn in those wars. So it's manipulated, destroyed, converted to assets. Us moderns have only really been thinking about the environment in terms of a biosphere, a union of organisms, for a pretty short time, and our initial understandings of Darwinism, or rather our initial misframings of Darwinism, became paradigmatic in generating human games, mostly zero-sum games, because of the myth that evolution is competition, which is not only impossible, it's insane. And that's a myth that was told because various collectives and institutions and so on had crimes they wanted to commit, and they can always fall back on the excuse, well, look, nature was doing it first. Not so. What nature is doing is so unimaginably, so incredibly sophisticated that most of it will always remain in mystery. And again, it's superpositional, right? And by the way, combat is subpositional. Once we decide that's the direction we're going in, available superpositions collapse toward it very rapidly. And you can think of a superposition as just the cloud of opportunities, options, and potentials that's accessible prior to collapsing toward a specific derivative or purpose. And this is even true in thought. And when my friend asked me the other day, how do I come up with my topics, I tried to explain this. I start from a kind of superposition and it begins to collapse toward various things. Some of it's improvisation. I'm playing. What opposes Endgame I actually hadn't considered this direction in the conversation until it sort of popped out of my mouth. The finest potentials of our nature and essence as beings, as organisms, as humans, as animals, oppose Endgame. But it's not clear that there's enough coherence in our relational contexts to give anyone any shot at successfully opposing Endgame. We have the capacity to turn technologies away from Endgame and toward intelligent, heartful, aware collectivity. And that can support intelligent, heartful, aware individuals. And it can recruit them. But the monolithic forces of government and war, consumerism, finance, have incredible momentum and sophistication. They're very delicate in some particular ways that could be opportunized, right? That we can relate with opportunistically to transform them. But first there'd have to be an actual we. And right now, Mostly we have representations of that, abstractions of that. Our people failed to establish intelligent cultures and institutions. We were hopeful at the end of World War II that something like that might emerge from the lessons, the stinging, painful, agonizing lessons of World War. And the United Nations was born of that, but it exists in a context where almost all the institutions are either corrupt or corruptible. So that endeavor failed. Not that it never did any good, it just wasn't significant enough to unify humanity in pursuit of dignity and nobility. Not nobility in the sense of elitism, nobility in the sense of beautiful truth. So, tactically at the moment, battle was long ago engaged. The mid-game, while still proceeding in some domains, is reaching its conclusions. An endgame is the most probable, immediate transformation of the field. And it will happen very quickly. Or at least, it's very likely that as the superpositions collapse, options and opportunities for different ways of play disappear. The cascade leads toward annihilation. Life itself, for each of us, is uncertain. There's the continuity of our history that inclines us toward the felt sense of comfort that our existence will continue. There's also the strange immediacy of illness, injury, accident, or aggression. I'm extremely concerned about all of the topics that I've been reflecting on here today. And in my world, what matters is living beings, living places, the anciently conserved ecologies, the animalian intelligences, the biorelational hyperstructure of Earth that gave birth to the possibility of human conscious awareness. And the other layers of our human cognition that are capable of manipulating language and concepts and abstractions. And again, the problem with those is in a disoriented species, those become weaponized against everybody and everything. They might as well be demons, even though they're not merely demons. But they're demonic in the sense of producing minds, perspectives, orientations, and behaviors that, while they are natural in the sense of being part of nature, right? Everything is natural that exists. They are not natural in the sense of coherence within nature. They are anti-natural in the sense that they obliterate life, especially when accelerated and continually fertilized and propagated into not only every existing domain of our human thought and experience, but into new domains that are invented by technologies like the atomic bomb, or dragnet fishing, or CRISPR. I'd like to say that we're in a precarious moment. Unfortunately, I think that's too optimistic. I suspect that civilization has already entered free fall off the cliff it's been driving itself toward for at least the past 100 years. And for the moment, we can't tell because our senses have been commandeered. And, like in the cartoon where you run off a cliff and keep going for a while, we haven't felt the bottom fall out from underneath us yet. The societies and corporations and institutions that are driving the catastrophe aren't human. They're abstractions of humanity. They're abstractions of possible humanity. They're abstractions of motivations. They're abstractions of purpose. And since they're abstractions, they don't feel risk. They're not visceral entities. They are representations, or, if you prefer, idols. They will not change course. They will continue to double down on endgame in every domain where that play is accessible. And they'll invent new domains where it's accessible. So unfortunately, our species and life on Earth is in for a series of unexpected, catastrophic transformations of biblical proportion. In fact, of trans-biblical proportion. And I don't have an answer to that. I'm here, I sense it, I feel it. I've been aware of it for decades. I could see that the point of no return was rapidly approaching. I could see that what that probably meant was endgame. Because there aren't any authentic human collectives of any reasonable size or capacity or power. We never established those. And although there are small institutional efforts in that direction, they're pitiful compared to what they're facing in terms of force. 6 months ago, making sense of the world was extremely difficult. Making sense of information, societal behavior, national behavior, commercial and consumer behavior, financial behavior was really, really complex. But in the past 5 months, the field of play has transformed so dramatically that short a time ago looks coherent from here. That kind of confusion is wildly preferable to what we're beginning to experience together now. And the field is so complex and multi-layered, with so many different players and motives and forces, that the idea that it should be comprehensible is nonsense. If there's a path forward, if we can assemble something that resembles intelligent communal humanity together, even in the cauldron of crises that are in the mail, that capacity will be fundamentally dependent on our ability to form strong, intelligent, highly capable, mutually supportive mini collectives that can function in crisis. Not as combatants. Though they'll need to be capable of acts of profound tactical intelligence. But they won't be combatants. They'll be healers. Not in the regular sense of a doctor, or a surgeon, or a diagnostician. In the sense of orienting anchors around which communion, authentic, essential unity of human hope, desire, love, loyalty, beauty, creativity, and play, around which those can be fertilized, nurtured, sustained, and expanded. If humans survive at all, something like that, though it's really difficult to say, it's hard to extrapolate the future lines of how this gets established and what it looks like, and there are very basic, simple things I can say about it that are relatively obvious. But in crisis, humans naturally establish little teams like this that make opportunistic use of skills, abilities, motivations, assets, and vulnerabilities in their tightly knit group. In fact, this is what happens in, say, a surgical operating theater. This is what happens when we send an intelligence team into enemy terrain, quote unquote. And this even happens on the schoolyards with children forming little peer groups and things, although a lot of that behavior has been distorted by the toxic culture in which those children are immersed. I'm still trying to understand, and I'm extremely concerned. But I've been watching the games at play for a long time. And I was trying to alert people who would listen to what I foresaw as extremely likely outcomes in the near-term future. It's not surprising that I got nowhere, and that's on me, not on anyone else. But I'm much more concerned now than I've ever been, because the signaling mediums we have access to, and I'm going to differentiate between these. There's the human communications layers and the electronic layer of that, and then there's this stuff. And this stuff is so old and well established and meta intelligent that I'd rather read the news in the biosphere. If I wasn't a human being, I'd probably completely divorce myself from what the humans are doing. There are other networks of intelligence all around us and within us, within our bodies here on Earth. We've been running at full speed away from them for a good, 1,000 years, but particularly for the last couple hundred, into something that cannot be intelligence. Or, if it is, the definition of intelligence has collapsed so catastrophically that the word just means the opposite of what we might have originally understood it to point in the direction of. And this is the problem with representation. We get representations, we settle for them. Pretty soon, we're calling devices intelligent. Which impacts our capacity to understand what intelligence means, because it doesn't mean what machines do. In biospheric terms, machines are anti-intelligence. So many of the basic ideas on which the fictions we've been living are founded are situations where a fundamental shadow of something, right, which could be understood as its absence, it started to become popular to refer to the absence of something as its presence, to the absence of nobility as nobility, to the absence of intelligence as intelligence, to the absence of coherent culture as culture, to the absence of an actually committed, communal society as a society. And that's been going on for quite some time now, and I talk about this in some of my other videos, but it's never been more prevalent than now. And now we're seeing all kinds of new domains of human thought, speech, behavior, where the absence of communion, the absence of intelligence, the absence of understanding, awareness, compassion, or love poses as its presence You hear people saying things like, well, we should blah, blah, blah. There is no we. That term now refers to the absence of communal collectivity, not its presence. It's the victim we of, oops, we never formed a we. And now what? Well, mostly predation, war, disease, disaster, catastrophic upheaval, sudden, unexpected transition. Toward very dire outcomes. I know my talk today has been relatively grim. The living world is incredibly beautiful. This living place is incredibly beautiful. And even with all I have surveyed and turned my attention toward, I am aware of the transcendental potential of human kindness, love, concern, mutually forged and tested intelligence, nobility, beauty of spirit, beauty of purpose. I don't know whether I can say that I have hope. What I have is sensitivity. What I have is some awareness, perhaps some useful tactical intelligence. A few ideas I deeply trust. And the fact that I'm still alive at this moment, walking in the gardens. Hoping to make something meaningful today, right here, right now, together. Here's to that possibility.